Okay, in 1772, after just a couple of years of starting that mission, they brought in more supplies and men, soldiers, and realized now they're not having to bring this from Spain. They own Mexico too, so they're bringing all these people up that are living in Mexico. And the first sergeant that ran the troops for the fort was named Manuel Nietos. Now you all know the name Los Nietos around here. He was in charge for at least another 10 years at the San Diego mission, but they also marched in the first 2 years from the San Diego mission all the way up to Monterey and planted 4 or 5 more missions up to Monterey and then marched back. 1804 is when he died. Okay, at that point, all of his properties and holdings were divided up into 5 different ranchos that went to his family, his kids, his wife. We've been on a couple of tours of large old ranchos with the club in the past few years, and those are part of that original tract that's divided up. By 1834, that's when his was divided up, and Juan Perez was given the land of the San Gabriel Mission. He was the priest there, I believe. And that became known as Paseo de Bartolo Ranch. So the property that he got actually is all of Whittier that we know of today. Was all part of it. Actually, out it looks like to either Santa Gertrudis or First Avenue at the border of Orange County. It was all Rancho de Bartolo. So everything is horseback, whatever, to get here. By the 1840s, people from the United States back east are moving out here, and there's becoming conflicts. So in 1848, they finally gave up. They signed what's called the Treaty of Hidalgo and gave all of California ownership to the United States, along with Texas and New Mexico and Arizona and Nevada. And it was a pretty big block of land. And in trade, the U.S. government gave Mexico $15 million for that property. Now, the reason that all of that's important is to show how this wouldn't be here if none of that had happened. In 1848, in February, the first week of February 1848, is when they signed the treaty. The third week of January, 10 days before, is when they found gold at Sutter's Mill. But there was no communication yet, so none of those people had any idea about the gold when all this treaty was signed. Imagine if it had been 6 months earlier, Mexico would have fought tooth and nail to keep this forever, and we might not be a part of the United States. Now, as far back as that is, just to put it in perspective, this is still all almost 20 years before the Civil War starts. Okay, we go through the Civil War, and during the war, a lot of rail lines are put in because they need to be able to move troops and guns and ammunition through the South, and they're being torn up. But the railroad companies were now a strong manufacturing and assembly thing. And right after 1865, when the Civil War ended, they started building a railroad across the United States. And that ended up being Promontory Point, Utah, is where the eastern part ended. And the western part started at San Francisco and met in Promontory Point. And so we now finally had a rail line across the country. Well, that's 1865. So 1869 actually is when that finally opened. So you can see all the people that were here for the gold rush, which was 1849, 50, 51, they all had to come by wagon train or come by ship. There was no transportation here. And because of it, this property really wasn't worth much money to anybody. You know, granted, Manuel Nietos got all these thousands of acres, but what are you going to do with it? You know? And then it took another 6 or 7 years for Southern Pacific Railroad to put in a line from San Francisco to Los Angeles. So now we're up to 1876. You can finally get here by train. And so transportation is becoming available. 1868, now that it's part of America, Joseph Gherkins purchased a land grant from the United States to buy Uptown Whittier. It was 160 acres, and basically he was a sheep rancher. He was going to do his sheep ranching here. And he bought the little shack, or built the little shack that is today now the Bailey House. It's been added on to and improved, but he was the one that actually built the Bailey House. If you can imagine, once again, property's not worth very much. He got 160 acres at $1.25 an acre with a $34 filing fee. So less than $350 to buy Whittier. Now, normally, and when I listen to different stuff through the museum and through the Bailey House, they really don't talk very much about Gherkins. Joseph Gherkins, this first guy that bought it. I've heard stories about him losing it for back taxes and whatever, but that's actually not the case. In 1877, while he still owned the property here, he became the police chief of Los Angeles, the very first police chief of Los Angeles. And he owned part owners of a market and had housing materials down there. So within 2 years, when he sold to John Thomas, it was at that point it was too much of an effort for him to come out here because he was so very much involved in Los Angeles. So in 1879, John Thomas bought Gherkins' property, 160 acres, and added to his acreage, which was 1,259 acres around that small Uptown Whittier area. So now he's got a pretty big property. At the time that John Thomas bought, and this is where it gets confusing because you can now get a grant from the United States, but you can also buy from the people that own the ranchos. So John Thomas bought all of his from Rancho de Portola, which was the man running the San Gabriel Mission. And so when he bought Gherkins' place out and had the whole suite, and in 1887 is when he sold it to the Quakers. Okay, the Quakers had come from back east looking for a new area to settle the Quaker church, separate from everything that was back east. In doing that, they needed transportation to get here. They needed people to come, and basically it was only 4 or 5 people that were the key Quakers that came for this original purchase. You had Jonathan Bailey, who owned a ranch and a grain mill in Ohio. He was very successful. He was well off. And then you had Akia Pickering, which we all know Pickering Road, and a couple of other people that Lindley and Newland, Newland Street, John Painter, Painter Street. These are all of the 5 that first came together. They put their money together. They organized what's known as the Pickering Land and Water Company. And you would have thought Pickering was something to do with land and water, but he doesn't. When they named it the Pickering Land and Water Company, Jonathan Bailey was the president. Pickering never was. Now, Pickering was a railroad man. He lived in Chicago, and he was very well off. And so he is the one that was able to assemble all these people and get them train rides now down to LA through all of the holdings that they had so that they could get the property. And immediately after purchasing the property, then they brought in surveyors to survey the property so that they could sell it. It was all about dividing it up and making money. If you know where Rocky Cola used to be, it's on the corner of Philadelphia and Greenleaf. Out in the curb in the front, there's a brass placard that shows that is the very center of Whittier. That's where the surveyors started and divided Whittier up from that point. So all the roads were put in actually on a north and south, east and west positioning. So when you look at where they come down to Whittier Boulevard, you notice nothing straight. Everything's all off on an angle. Okay. The reason for that is Whittier Boulevard at that time was known as County Road. The County Road had already been there for 25, 30 years and went all the way out through La Habra. So it didn't follow any north or south. It followed what was easiest to put a road in. And that's how that got there. One of the other early roads that I noticed, and it's kind of why we came the way we did, we came up Norwalk Boulevard. Okay. in those early days, long before Whittier, that was known as North Walk. That was just a trail that took you from down towards the coast all the way up to Workman Mill Road, which is just around the corner. And when we go to lunch, we'll head that way. So Augustus Gregg wasn't a Quaker, but he found out about what was going on here and wanted to provide his services as a realtor. And he was actually the one that was involved with several of the other Quakers in purchasing this section where all these big headstones are. Estimated 1891, 1892. Records are really vague on it. If you go in and look up Rose Hills, they'll swear that there was nothing here before 1914. Well, I'm looking at something right there that's been here a lot longer than 1914. But Augustus Gregg actually, in 14, when it became Rose Hills, the partners that he had that were originally in it were concerned about getting their money out of it. He paid them off and went with another organization and started Rose Hills. Now, the way it got its name was a contest where a young lady, people wrote into the contest to give it a name. And as a young lady, she would hike all these hills up here, and there were wild roses all over the place. And she picked the name Rose Hills for it, and that's what they accepted. And she got a $50 fee for the contest. Mm-hmm. So, really, the other thing, when Bailey got here, they would tell you there was nobody out here. But that's not really the case. 1848 is when this became part of United States territory. And Pio Pico, who was quite wealthy, he had been governor of California down in the San Diego area. He got his monies together and he bought up a huge portion of this Rancho de Portola, which is part of what we're standing on now. And all of Whittier was on Rancho de Portola. So if you know where Pico's mansion is, just farther out Whittier Boulevard, that was his homestead, and he started selling off property around there. Right next to him was Harriet Strong and her family. They bought like 160 acres right next door to Pio Pico, which extended towards the west end of what is now Whittier. In 1887, when all the purchasing was happening here, a wealthy man from back east, Simon Murphy, he decided to come out and buy property. So Simon Murphy was the Murphy Ranch. You probably all know where Murphy Ranch Park is, and there's the Murphy Ranch baseball diamond that's up on Colima. If you can imagine, his ranch started, and this is vague, some of this by folklore and tale, but it started just past East Whittier School on Whittier Boulevard, right about the Toyota dealership. And it went all the way to the middle of the Whitwood Mall, past where we were parked this morning, where the Whittier Water Company buildings are on Whittier Boulevard. So this all seemed like a great deal. Everybody was set up to now start selling property. 1891 comes a great big depression right in the middle of everything. Property values drop, nobody's buying, it's hard to do anything with it. And so a lot of stuff started to become citrus because you could make some money on citrus crops. Murphy Ranch, he bought with the intent of building houses, and he put in oranges that entire length of the boulevard and up into the hills. And he was about to lose his shirt, but he got lucky. They found oil on his property. So oil is what made Murphy Ranch finally exist. I don't know if any of you have ever at any point in your life done the hiking trails that are up on Colima. When you walk on those trails, you'll notice yellow pipes sticking out of the ground every now and again with a little flag on them, like MW17, MW02. Those are the wellheads of the Murphy Ranch wells that have been taken out, and they're still got pipes there to identify where they're at in case there's any further issues. I think I brought you up to the beginnings of what Whittier was about.